Welcome to Playing With Inference, a podcast looking at the intersection of generative AI and gaming. And today I am coming from Rockefeller Center, actually. So we are revisiting the use of generative AI to translate tabletop role-playing game experiences digitally, as well as elevating and enhancing the creativity in those type of experiences. Now, this is a topic we've covered before, and we're going to be looking at some new approaches and some advancements in that space. So I'm excited to dive into it.
Yeah, and joining us for that today are Will and David, who are the co-founders and the only developers of Friends and Fables, which is one of the earlier LLM-driven RPGs. Previous to Friends and Fables, David was an engineer at Amazon and a couple of other AI startups, while Will is an engineer from an ad tech background. Will, David, welcome.
Hey, happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
So, Friends and Fables.
Yes.
Tell us about it.
You want to take it? Oh, wait. Sorry, what was the question?
Tell us about Friends and Fables. So, what's the one-liner, the short story? What's the long one?
So we actually just went through a whole marketing refresh. The new one-liner is Friends and Fables is a platform to create and play AI RPGs. That we don't say tabletop specifically in the one-liner for SEO purposes, but it is primarily focused around a tabletop experience.
So one of the things that stood out, so when we met maybe over a year ago, and when I saw first, one of the things that stood out was that there is an actual game state, right? The characters have stats, and the characters are in some sort of, I guess back then it was like a 2D plane, but there is some sort of underlying map and structure to the game versus just a game that lives entirely in the LLM's world model, so to call. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the way it first started off was we first had this idea to create like an AI game master, like how everybody does, right? They see ChatGPT, they think, can I have a GM run Dungeons and Dragons for me? And very simply, at the beginning, it was just like a Discord bot. And okay, be a dungeon master and try to run this interesting campaign. But as you go through that, you realize, oh, the LLM can't keep track of things like your inventory, can't keep track of your spell slots, any of this type of stuff. So naturally, it's like, you need to store that somewhere else. You got to persist this into a game state that the AI can then access, but is not always within its context window, right? So just naturally going through that process of running into these limitations and then figuring out, okay, we need to store this somewhere. We need to build this. We need to have a map that keeps track of where you are. So then like the scene can change, right? In a natural way. And just going through those iterations, we just kept adding more and more game state, which has been a struggle in a lot of ways because you got to figure out just like the game state's good to have constraints, but sometimes too many constraints can be a bad thing, right? Where you need it to also be fluid and flexible. And then some players don't like having too many constraints, some do.
Yeah, I think you mentioned right away that like many folks have looked at large language models like ChatGPT and they're like, okay, where's the AI dungeon master? Where's the AI game master? And that's been talked about in a couple different blogs, and we've had a few different products that have tried to attempt it. If we start with that concept, what does that mean to you guys? So, because we say it as a concept, an AI dungeon master, but in theory, there's a lot of things that could do or could be. So when you're thinking about it with respect to your product, what does that mean to you guys?
Yeah, so this is actually something that we spent a lot of time thinking about, and it's actually like a really hard thing to figure out how to communicate. I think we know what it means now because we've been building it, but everybody has these like traditional models that they think of this in, right? I think the easiest way to start is say AI game master, right? But in order to have it all work, it's some weird hybrid mishmash of an AI game master, a virtual tabletop that has everything integrated, world building tools, like all of these things have to work in concert. And it's become this new thing that like doesn't really have a name yet because we're inventing it on the fly. So it's like hard to tell people exactly what it is because there's not a great name for it yet. Maybe the name is Friends and Fables right now. But it's like you can just have an AI game master when you're just talking to ChatGPT and you're just like pretending to do that, right? But to have something that's like playable, to have something where someone can come in and create the characters in the world and orchestrate things, you have to have a whole platform to be able to do that. You need a place to build the world. You need a place for people to come in and actually chat And
Does
so
that?
it all
Oh,
has
go
to
ahead.
work
Go ahead.
together. Does that? Oh, I was just like,
Yes, I think the next
was I
question, and of
answering
course,
what you were trying to get
I'm
at?
gonna have way too many questions, so at some point we'll have to make sure we get back onto what other track or agenda. But is this, because we could look at this a couple of different ways, right? And is it a tool that replaces a human dungeon master? Does it augment a human dungeon master, or is it something altogether? Is that model a convenient model, but maybe we're being too specific around the tabletop Dungeons and Dragons, a traditional game master, dungeon master, and some players and those roles. So in that kind of framing, where did you start and where are you at now?
I think like initially to start with, one of the main motivations we had was like it's hard to get a D&D session going because of all the barriers to entry. You got to find a dungeon master. You have these scheduling conflicts. Someone has to be the DM, and that's not always a fun thing to do. It's like sometimes someone's a forever DM. You have a lot of work to do. So it's initially the first concept was like try to have an AI fill that gap for you so you can keep playing more. And just like in terms of replacing GMs, like I don't think that's ever going to happen just because one idea that we've been mulling about is just there's the different levels of fidelity of play. So what I mean by that is if you play in person, that's like the peak best experience. It's like you're getting together with your friends, you're getting some takeout, you're having an awesome time. The problem is though, you probably have that once a week, usually like 4 hours, because it's just harder to set up to get in person. You go down a bit in fidelity, you get a little bit easier to access, which is you can play virtually on like Roll20 or a Foundry. You get a VTT going. It's a little bit worse, but it's a lot more accessible. And you can do that maybe a few times a week, or just if you can't get in person, you can play more. And then where we think Friends and Fables can fit in is you go down one more, where it's a similar analogy would be like you have meeting in person, you have video calls, and then you have texting. I think Friends and Fables fits in that, where it's like you have in real life play, you have ETTs, and then you have texting where you can play Friends and Fables like asynchronously.
Okay, I was going to ask about
you can
post.
do like play by post. Right. You can just click up and play. Yeah. It's not like a replacement because you can't. It's not going to be playing in person, but it's something that's similar. That's like a D&D light experience where it's like, okay, if I have a few minutes or a few hours, I can just play this pretty easily.
Wait, so how much are you sticking to like D&D rules?
Pretty closely right now,
as best as we can, but D&D rules get really complicated.
That was another good question. So for some of the listeners of the podcast may know this, but I am a forever GM, and I'm not in my home office, but so tabletop role playing games is definitely an area of hobby and passion for me. And so we could also just spend the entire time probably geeking out on tabletop role playing games. But that is a good question of like how much of the it was really interesting because I've run play-by-post games, and there's a different feel to how those work. I've even had ones where we were in person or sometimes just video every so often. But between those more synchronous experiences, we would have these asynchronous kind of play-by-post. The reason I bring that up is because I want to make sure I'm not mistaken. Do you expect people to dip in and out of your experience? Or so like I could be playing a campaign of my own and then it's, we can't get together. The forever GM's not there and so you guys can move to Friends and Fables? Or is it like this is an experience that lives exclusively in your game, in your platform?
Yeah, so I would say right now people use the platform differently. I think 80% of it is actually just solo play where people are just jumping in and playing solo. For the group play, our original intuition was that it would be more async play, and I think that does happen, but it seems like people do still like to show up at the same time and all be actively engaged. That's just what we found, but I think there's a spectrum. I would say the asynchronous play is a little bit lower than what we expected it to be, but yeah. And just going back real quick, one last thought about like the replacing AI game masters thing. I think something interesting is that initially, like we were thinking, like we're going to fill this gap. But what we've realized now is that it's not like a lot of people hate on the product because they're like, you're trying to replace all the game masters out there with robots. And like, that sounds pretty bad. But I think what people don't always see is that like we're more of a replacement for other entertainment time. Like we're competing not with human game masters, but we're competing with YouTube and TikTok and other video games and books, right? Like we're trying to fill that kind of entertainment time and space instead of replacing humans. If that makes sense.
But those are like, so I agree with that wholeheartedly. But I think like books, YouTube, other video games, TikTok, all sit in very different type of entertainment diets. And I wonder, like, where do you guys see that? Where do you guys see, maybe this is a little bit of the jumping in and out, right? Like, where do you guys see people that play, for instance, Fables? What is the type of entertainment? The way I like to think is I go play, I love to play chess, and I can play my rapid or classic. But the truth is 90% of the time I'm just playing bullet because that's where I can squeeze in between meetings, right? And that's just, it's the TikTok of games for me, is just playing bullet chess. So I guess, like, where do you guys think people playing Friends and Flavors right now, where do they allocate, what was that? Where do they allocate their time? What type of entertainment is this for them?
Probably like casual mobile gaming.
I see.
Casual, yeah. I think also a big part of it that we haven't necessarily touched yet is just like a lot of the time also goes into world building. So I think playing, a lot of it happens like in between those moments where like you're like commuting and like you're on the train and like you're playing. Some people also just like that is their main activity where like they're just at home like on their laptop playing. It's just a campaign. And then also I think a lot of times is like there's people who also they just tend to world build more than they play, right? So it's like those for forever GMs. I find that a lot of them they come to the platform wanting to play, and then they also just end up just like building it like again and spending more time.
That's interesting because we've talked a little bit about, and like I said, we may meander through a couple topics. We talked a bit about like the just goal of what is a AI game master, and we may come back. There are some questions there I do want to come back to, but of course. But I want to actually make sure that everyone's listening and we're all on the same page of both like the product as exists today and really the like experience that you intend to have players. So like when I look at it, to your point, yes, there are tools for those that aren't familiar with it. There are tools to build maps, right? There's tools to build like lore or have lore connected to the story. So there's a lot of world building, right? And so I'm going to describe it in a way that's probably unfair, and I want you to help me understand the difference. So if I took something like AI Dungeon and like a VTT, so a virtual tabletop for those who do tabletop games, and smashed those together, am I getting close to the product that you have or that you're envisioning, and how is it different from that? Because that might give some people some grounding places of products they might be familiar with. Or is it like it's just Roll20 with AI, but then what would that even really mean? So can you help like paint a vision of the ideal player experience with the product, because there's such a wide range of what role-playing games are and tabletop role-playing games are and all these kind of things.
Totally. I think you're getting close. I think the primary difference between us and AI Dungeon right now is mainly like the game state and the game mechanic, right? AI Dungeon is much more freeform. It's more similar to a traditional chatbot where your message history builds your context and there's additional context brought in, but most of the state kind of lives in the tokens of the context. Whereas for us, we have persistent game state. And then that game state also gives people who are world building a way to create things. And so I would say that we are closer to a Roblox for digital TTRPGs, if that makes sense. So we're a platform where like creators can come in and create all of the things that you need to play the TTRPG, right? The world, the characters, the lore, everything. And then players can come in and experience that through our VTT and AI Game Master.
When you say world building, what do you like? Walk me through like what that entails, right? Is it like maps? Is it like fan fiction? What's the breadth of what they're building? So that's normally the area that I like to do more. Like I will probably do more a lot of the world building side than actually play any single campaign. So yeah, I would like to hear like what that entails.
I think it's basically all of the above. So the way it first started in like the very early versions is like you just have a world that you're playing in, and it was just like a description text. And then you start realizing, oh, like you can break up all the different things that make up a world into like different like entities, right? So you have your characters, you have your items, you have your races, classes, spells, all these sorts of things. And like the reason why we even really got into world building in the first place was just like, if you don't have this world for the AI to go off of, it ends up being like pretty stale because the AI can't really, it's not good at being creative, right? Like it'll keep doing the same things over and over again, giving you the same plot lines. But humans are being really good at being creative, and they like to create, right? So it's okay. We have this world. If people just want more of it, especially the maps, like we found that maps and having that visual experience was like a really big part of it for some players. So like all of the tools, essentially a world is composed of like a map. In the map you can set areas, you can set points of interest like a tavern or a dungeon that you can then go visit. In those points of interest, they're all like their own separate like 2D battle maps where you can also place things like characters or monsters to run into. So as the world builder, you're creating all those things where you might start off with from a map. You might create a forest. In that forest, you might create like a hut and set up an encounter with characters or monsters. And then all the other supporting stuff for a character that you might have. What kind of spells does it have? What kind of background lore is there that you can put into the world for the AI to search and reference?
Can you import assets from? Can I import a map or lore? Like, okay, so let me just color what I'm thinking. And I've mentioned this before, but I play all types of stories in my mind when I play RimWorld, when I play Civilization. Like I play like 10 minutes and then I stare like blankly at the screen, just thinking about what's going on. If you were like an external observer, I am just like plugged into the matrix, right? That's just how I interact with this type of games. And I always want to have zoom in and be a citizen in like my city or draw plot lines of what's going on in the ponds of RimWorld. And I'm curious. So one of the things that I've always wanted is like being able to export that into some other ways to explore the mini universe that I've been building by playing. So I'm curious if there's ways for importing assets for a general world or artifacts from the outside world, or if right now all I have to do is like creating in there.
So we have ways for you to add your own images right now, but we don't necessarily have a way for you to export something from your RimWorld game and then import it and have the AI build everything. But that's something we've been thinking about. So
really?
Maybe eventually, yes. But for now, we have these like AI tools that make it easy for you to recreate things. You pop it open and just like type in a quick description of what you want, and then it'll fill out the form for you. But that's still like a pretty early version of it. And in the future, we might make it so you can upload a PDF and it can scaffold out the world for you a little bit more.
And along those lines, so when I think of this type of games, I always think of a lot of bias towards fantasy versus RimWorld and Civilization are like one is more like alt history and the other one is much more like space western. Do you find how much of Friends and Fables is it geared towards fantasy, implicitly or explicitly? And then also I wonder are there genres or fiction genres that the LLMs are pretty bad at? If I choose, I don't know, Mexican Revolution novella, is it going to be really bad at it?
I would say it's a bit of a mix. Like as far as the genres on there, I think one thing that's nice about D&D is people have been homebrewing D&D forever, and it's like you can it's obviously not perfect, but like you can fit the concept of characters, races, and classes to many different things beyond this. Yeah. So people just make it work within the constraints of those like D&D concepts and like archetypes. As far as like any genre that doesn't work well, I haven't personally come across one. I'm not sure if you have, but
there's definitely people who have done some like strange historical stuff on the platform, and it seems to work. So yeah, I can't say that there's any particular genre that it can't do. I think at least for us, it's because the world builders have already laid out most of the context for the LLM to use. So it always ends up feeling at least decent. I think if it were doing it from scratch with not as much of the content pre-built, maybe you'd find that some models are worse at some things because there's knowledge gaps. But for us, like we have the whole RAG system for all your lore and all the other stuff. So the LLM at least has like a
talk about RAG systems, or more specifically, maybe not specifically, the problem that we're facing with this type. We face all sorts of interesting challenges building a product like this. And I'm going to be a little grandiose, but I think one of the challenges is the answer to the question is, what is true? What is truth? Is a question we have to answer in this. And to your point, if you start off naively with just working with a large language model and the state, so state is a form of truth, right? Is if you just keep that in just context of a large language model, you're going to have some challenges, right? So you've already created external forms of truth, right? Like on the map, where the positions are, stats, you have some rules implemented. And I find that many who've worked in this space, this is one of the areas where you need to make some calls or hit some challenges around determining what is or isn't out of bounds for truth, what systems get to establish truths, and how do you track them. As an example, obviously you found that you needed to constrain the world by having this external game state, right? So like that constrains it in some way to be like, Ramon is here, Aaron is here, and that's constrained by there. But if we go into a dialogue system and Ramon is the blacksmith or something, and a player's talking with him, and Ramon starts talking about his cousin who has this like magical dagger, if that was not like either like if that's not in the lore, is that now in the lore? Is it allowed to do that? If it's never allowed to do that, right? So you could say, no, you have to stick what's in the lore. Now we've kind of lost some of the creative power. But if we also let it run amok, like, how do you track that? How do you make sure that it's like, now there's this cousin who exists, right? And we might end up going on an entire adventure searching for this cousin that just came out of nowhere, right? If we allow for that establishment of facts. Have you faced this problem? Do you even think it's a problem? And if you have faced it, how do you try to solve it?
We've definitely faced that problem.
I think it definitely varies depending on like the scenario you're in. So what I mean by that is like in combat, having those constraints are really important. If I'm not within the range to make this attack, like it should just never happen, right? Like that is the combat constraint. Maybe you might want to apply like a rule of cool or something, but generally it's like these are very fixed. But then to your point, when it comes to dialogue, that's one where you have to let the LLM or the AI just generate some of that.
Yeah, at that point, like,
if you constrain it too much, you do lose that like flexibility. Right? Yeah. Exactly. Like you might as well just pre-write the whole story. So like the way we handle that is generally like you try to tell it to use as much of the previous context as possible. Try to ground your next narration steps like in this lore, in this current place that you're in. But it will just make stuff up. It'll just be like, oh yeah, here's this new character. And the way we handle that is we allow it, and then we'll actually just generate and create that after it like spoke it into existence. So if it spoke of a character that hasn't actually been in the world yet, then we'll just generate, and now it does exist in the world. And then the state can be referenced and updated later.
But this opens up a kind of worms. It depends on how much you want to like stick to rules, but it opens a kind of worms because then you are subject to prompt injection, right? Like I can somehow start instantiating things in the world.
Yeah, like I go up to
tricking the LLM to
blacksmith and say, like, how's your cousin who really likes me and is very rich and owes me money? And you're like, oh yeah, that cousin. Like, yeah, he owes me a lot of money. I think a kingdom, in fact, actually. What is the kingdom he owes me?
Yeah, you can, right? That's something that if you try hard enough, you can do it. And I think that we have some cases where if you try to pull out a lightsaber in like a normal fantasy world, like maybe it'll be like, oh, like that doesn't make any sense here. I think like the language models are smart enough to push back a little bit right now. But I think if you like really try to force it, yeah, you can prompt inject it. But I think we find that most players just don't do that because they're here to play and they actually want to keep everything immersive, right? The reason why they're playing this is they want an immersive experience that feels like it makes sense. They hate it when something breaks immersion or something feels out of place. So it's more like an honor system that is the players handle themselves, right? Because you're writing a book. You're not going to randomly place like some like crazy random thing in your own book. And I think when players are playing Friends and Fables, especially solo, it's closer to writing your own book and writing your own story than it is like trying to metagame the system.
You think this is true also when it's multiplayer? As in, or is that co-op book writing effort? Because I find, in my experience, I find that a lot of the role playing, at least again, bringing back to Civilization, a lot of that role playing or immersion breaks the moment you bring multiplayer. Is that the case for you guys as well, or do people who play this really take seriously the role playing?
I think people generally take the role playing pretty seriously, and like I think most people like
One thing I want to eventually build in is like more of a matchmaking system where if you are solo, you can just find someone to play with. But I think most people who play right now are already playing with people that they know. And so as a party, they agree on how they're going to role play and do things. And I think also like an interesting point just about the prompt injection of adding things to your world. I think part of it too is you don't even need to prompt inject, like you can just do it, because one thing we found is like in a game of D&D, you also ask questions just like out of character, right? Where you might ask for a clarification of a rule, you might want to just do something. And something we found is like in Friends and Fables, you can manage a lot of the UI, just like a lot of the state through the UI. But naturally, people just want to talk with the AI and just have them do things. Like if you forgot to create an item, they're like, oh, like instead of making that item themselves, they're like, hey, Franz, make this item. And to support that, we have this like separate mode where it's okay. In this out of character mode, he can just generate these things for you if the player's asking them, and it just helps them because naturally players just do that, and they just want.
I was wondering about that. That's great. Because in the play-by-post games that I've run, which are actually usually either forum or chat interface, to be very honest, we'll often have the in-character, out-of-character, like there's more than one, right? So that way you could have one where you've got everyone staying in character and the story is really there, but you have this kind of sidebar. So it's really interesting that you guys replicate something. It sounds like you replicate something very similar in your product.
Yes. And also, quick clarification, Franz is the name of our AI game master.
Now I have to ask where Franz came from.
Yeah, that's
good. Yeah, story there for where is Franz some dungeon master that like you're like had a beef with, and you're like, finally we get to control Franz.
No, we were just looking for a name that started with an F.
So going to the back to the truths a little bit. Once we've started to establish a point, and I think it's totally fair to say, look, some products we need to be more. It can be a product decision as much, right? Like a game design decision as much of like how important is this? But once we've made those decisions, then we also look at the quality. And I'm sure you've looked a little bit at the quality of dialogue or the quality of the decisions. In fact, I just came back from the AI in Games conference in London, and there were some talks around this topic, around like how to get large language models to perform better in different ways for kind of quality. So has this been another area that you put in effort, or that you see issues of like, how do you get better dialogue or better twists or surprises or kind of narrative kind of capabilities? Is that something that is just model dependent or part of your other system, or how do you solve that one?
I think it's definitely a mix. As far as like quality goes, like there's the narration, and then there's also things just like game state updates, right? So should you pick up this item? Should you drop this item? Those sorts of things are like a little bit easier to create evals around. And it's okay, here's like the baseline, here's like our eval data set of, in these cases, it correctly drops or adds the item or uses the spell. The thing with the narration that's really hard is it's not as like a hard eval, like it's subjective. What is good dialogue? What is good narration? And that varies from player to player preference. I think there's some things that are like universally true where like you might hit issues where it's, oh yeah, like it's talking about the same thing over and over again, like it's hitting a loop of a certain plot point that's already happened. Like those are objectively like, okay, we don't want to have that in the system. But then other things, it varies a lot just depending on like player preference. We do try to create systems where it's like you have a separate step that like plans for the GM to give him direction on like where to go and like where to take the story. But again, because it's like our evals there is mainly just like vibing. It's okay, like we're gonna play test this, and does this feel better or worse compared to the previous version?
I'd also add that this is like probably what we've spent maybe like 60 to 70% of our development time on. Like
on what?
Like the eval
on the narrative?
Not evals, but just getting the system to feel right, react correctly, and also not be overly tropey or not be overly repetitive. And a lot of those problems still exist in the product right now, and we're still tuning. Like we've probably gone through maybe 3 or 4 pretty big rewrites of the entire system. Yeah, and like we've figured things a bunch of different ways, especially as like new things have come out. Right, like we started on 2 years ago when we started on this like before tool calling was really a thing, and then before like agents were really a thing. So every like big leap in technology, like we've rejiggered everything, remapped everything.
So I remember in our Discord, I think it was you, Will, that complained that not many providers have the legit bias feature. So basically, the way, if I remember from that conversation, was that you guys want to use it to avoid tropey or repetitive things that they come up with. I kept something that I left wondering was like, how useful is that? Because at the end of the day, you're talking about like a single token or like a set of tokens versus a concept, right? It's easy, for example, in my experience back in the day, Sonnet 3.5 loved to use weather journals. So you open a box, and what did you find? A weather journal. You open the cupboard, what did you find? A weather journal. And it was like over and over. So that one is easy. Okay, we're just going to avoid the weather journals. But if it's more like a conceptual thing, like a more high level concept, it's not like the logit bias will help you on avoiding that type of repetitive theme to come back, because you're just avoiding the words. So it may find like dusted notebook, and it's like, okay.
Yeah, our versions of those that we've been dealing with lately are like intricately carved wooden boxes.
Oh yes, I've had that as well.
Yeah, like the ornate bird or something. Yeah, character names.
Yeah, I think there's like levels to the tropiness, right? So people do hate seeing those exact words and phrases coming up over and over again. And then there is also just like the narrative concepts that also come up again. And just like back to the point about trying to like eval like the narration. I think also something that's hard about that is just like one thing we tried to do, because like right now campaigns are just goes on forever, right? And it's if you try to keep something going on forever and having it be fresh, like that's hard for both a human and an AI. Like eventually you're going to repeat things. So we tried to constrain the problem to just let's try to create just one shots where it's like you have a beginning and then you have an end, and then you try to just have the AI just take you through that. So it's a bit more of an on the rails experience.
Have you tried?
But like even
sorry,
then,
I'm gonna
it's still a bit tricky.
Have you tried 5-room dungeon style adventures? Are you familiar with that archetype? Okay, we'll have a conversation offline. But for those, again, like for tabletop role playing games, there's one of the reasons I have liked stealing game design ideas from the tabletop community is because we do have many. At this point, actually, we have decades of game design specifically around this mix of how do we tell and create stories that are primarily driven through language, and then also have these interesting rules involved in them. And there's a wealth of resources out there. One test that I have tried, and it worked okay, was there's a very simple, I don't even know if it definitely would be a one shot, but it's a pretty small, it's called like a 5-room dungeon that has these kind of tropes of each room has a different type of thing, like the guardian in the beginning, and there's a twist something, and so it gives you these patterns. So I'm wondering if like when you're building these type of things, how much do you guide or constrain, because you already give Dungeons and Dragons or like fifth edition ish rules. So do you give other guidance of this is what a good dungeon master is or what they do?
At least in like the quest and one shot system, like what we're really trying to do is build a system where a world builder or an author or a player can come in and create whatever they want. We're trying to build the primitives that allow someone to build it, and then the AI game master will run it however the player built it. We're not really trying to be too opinionated on that part. And then in the normal campaign where someone's like playing like not with an on the rails quest, and it's more like freeform with the language model, in those situations, like we do have some prompting that is don't be too repetitive. Try to give the player something to react to, and we'll like dynamically inject different prompts in different situations here and there to try to help it be better. But we don't really give the language model like a full frame.
If we could talk about tech just a little. So I hear that as a form of prompt engineering to some degree. So you mentioned like you've rewritten the application a couple of ways. So we have, to get the results you want, we've got architecture, right? So the game state, how you're keeping the game state, or whether you use tool calling, or whether you have agents. We've got the model selection itself. We have potentially prompt engineering with those models or fine tuning. To the degree that you can or want to share, could you share a little bit more about some of the technologies you've used and how well they've worked, and anything about any particular models that you've found? Have you done any fine tuning, those type of things?
Just on fine tuning, since you mentioned it, I think like at the beginning, especially for the game state update stuff, we use a lot of fine tunes. So, okay, like in the early days, having a GPT 3.5, it really wasn't good at doing like item updates, stuff like that. Where the base model would get like 60%, and then if you fine tune, you get 80%. But now with all the recent updates, with the better and better base models, we find that it's just not worth it to take the time to fine tune. At least for us, because like the base model is just better. It's a lot more flexible to swap in and out. The latency also has like impact. Like typically from our experience, like the fine tuned models tend to be a little bit slower to respond. So that's typically not worth it. And then I think for us, what Will said, like I think in the really early days, it was a bit more of a workflow where it's here's this step, the 3 steps where it's here's like a pre-processing step where like you try to get signals about is the player like asking an out of character question? Are they taking a rest? Are they doing these sorts of things? And then you can route it to the next step, which actually does the narration based off those signals that can dynamically change the prompt. And then like after that narration happens, then you have some post-processing where it's okay, the player did this, the GM said this, now what do I have to do to update the game state? And like we found that what works best there is like you have an agent that just has all the primitives of the tools that it needs. So like it has a tool to be able to say, okay, you know what, you should ask for a skill check here. And then that'll show like a skill check on the UI. You'll have a primitive to update a character, like you can change its HP, things like that. And that gives you like a lot more flexibility in terms of what the system can do and what players can also program in with just like words and language and context.
Yeah. Also, in terms of models, what we've found is like we select models for being the fastest and cheapest model that can get the job done that is off the shelf. Mm-hmm. And we found that gives us the most flexibility, the best speed, and is at a cost that's actually sustainable for us. And like speed is it's hard to say whether speed or cost is more important. Cost is probably more important, but speed is a close second because in that pre-processing step that David mentioned, there's a lot that can happen. Like our RAG step is in there. We have to bring in all this context. There's some planning depending on the situation, right? Maybe there have to be some state updates that happen. Let's say you move to a different location, right? We have to update your token, put you over there, pull in all the context of what characters are at that location, and then bring those in before the narration step. So there's a lot that goes on there. And in order to get the narration to the user in time, the models have to be really fast, at least in the pre-processing side of things.
So you're talking about speed and cost. I mean, again, always draw. If at some point you're like, Ramon, you're asking too much, then please tell me. Are you guys using any of the like custom hardware providers like Grok or Cerebras? I think Sambanova is also one of these. Like they are very much on the speed is optimized, and presumably cost is not also that hefty. I wonder if like you prioritize speed to that level of we're just gonna go with one of these guys that are like chugging thousands of tokens per second.
Yeah, we do, especially for the stuff like you want to minimize the amount of time that a player is waiting for like a response, right? So everything that happens before the response and like the response itself has to be really fast. Things that happen in the post-processing can be a bit slower because the user has the message and they're reading it, so it can take a bit more time. But yeah, we do use the bulk of the workload will probably be on like a Grok like GPT or like a Gemini Flash type model, like these like middle tier models that are like really good and like really fast. Because going above that, once you go higher into the full, I don't know, like a full Claude Opus or Sonnet or like GPT-5, then it gets to be way too expensive, too fast.
I mean, Cloud Opus is the fastest way to find yourself,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah, 100%. It's sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So you are going. So what I'm hearing is then that you are using some of these custom hardware providers, but you're having like a mixture of models depending on what piece of the process.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and we've really broken everything down. Like one of the approaches that we've taken is start with the smallest, fastest models and try to break the problem down so that it works with those. I think there's like a lot of advice out there that's like start with the biggest model, like that's with that and then optimize for cost. And we've taken the other approach, and we found that it works well for us because it allows us to get features to market sooner, but also it's easier once we've broken the problems down into small pieces that the small models can actually handle collectively, it's easier to plug a bigger model in and consolidate it rather than going the other way around.
That's interesting. So you come from, we have a system and every now and then a new model pops up and that subsumes two pieces of the system and then we swap that, versus starting with a big model and starting and break it down into like sub pieces to make it work.
Yeah, because sometimes you find that if you start with the big model, you actually can't optimize enough to get to the speed and cost that you need.
I had something else that I wanted to ask on the model side. Yes, evals. So going back a little bit to evals, when a new model gets released, what we basically do is we have like most of the things we do is code generation during the game. So we have like our evals for how good and how fast is the specific model and provider for writing C# code. And then we plot it and then we immediately see if this is like on the Parento frontier or not. And then that's like a clear cut decision for us. This is something we're worth considering, or a good fallback, or this is garbage. For you guys, it sounded like you have a lot of more subsystems, and the evals that you were talking about, some of it is like proper evals and some of it was more like a vibe thing. So what's y'all's process to like evaluate a new model that just dropped in the market that looks good? How do you do a quick check of this is something that can actually serve one of our purposes or not?
Yeah, again, like if it's just like game state updates, like anything combat based, item based, like we have a set of evals for each scenario, and it's okay. There's new models here. We just swap it out, put in like the new model ID string, and then we run that eval set. And okay, is it passing all the same ones as it did before? Is it failing more cases? Is it, if the quality bar is there, like the accuracy, then okay, is it actually worth it to bring this one in? Because again, if it's too slow, it might not be worth it. Same thing if it just costs too much. I think also with like new models, I think something we found is a lot of the models that are being released, at least recently, are very focused on STEM and like coding and research. So they tend to be like pretty good for like tool calling, but then if you try to swap that in for the narration, and then you just vibe it out and just play like a campaign, you start feeling like it's a little bit off, or like sometimes it can't do things that our system needs to support. So things like dialogue tags to indicate which character is talking. Some models just can't do that, and then we can't use them.
I think it's a little bit of an artifact of we reached some sort of like saturation, or we've essentially crawled all the data that there is to be crawled on the internet. And then now the axis of development is basically everything that can be verifiable, which is code, math, STEM, right? So it's like that's the angle of improvement. And I feel like if you are putting that much emphasis at some point in that direction, you are going to end up getting some detriment on the more creative style writing or outputs.
I actually have a funny story about this one. So we tried, I think, one of the new DeepSeek models at one point, and when we were testing it, we were like, oh, this feels great. People are going to love it. And we put it out there, and we find very quickly that it loves to use bullet points. It loves to make lists. And it turns out our players hate bullet points, and they hate with a passion. And yeah, people were up in arms about that. And yeah, I think that's just one of those cases where that model was like a little bit more, cared more about that kind of formatting for whatever reason, maybe because of all the STEM content that it has. And
what about guardrails?
Yeah,
like related problems, both in you said there's a bit of an honor system. You're working with the players and the content that they want to build. They're probably opting in to a lot of the content that they want to build in theory. But one of the challenges can sometimes be that you want different guardrails than whatever things have been trained on. Like you might need villains who do villainous things in a narrative story. And has that been a challenge at all? Is that a factor for how you select certain models, or how do you get around that problem when you find it?
Yeah, it's definitely a factor that narrows like the selection of models that we can use for narration, because like things that are allowable in a fantasy context, some models don't like it, right? So if you're trying to kill somebody, which like maybe makes sense because it's just violence and it's all fictional, GPT is going to be like, no, you cannot do this. You have to be a good person and let's try to resolve this peacefully, right? So it definitely constrains the models that we can use in terms of that. But we try to use models that are a bit more liberal, like in terms of what they allow in fantasy context. And then we could even, sometimes we do like model switching like on the fly, where it's okay, we've detected that this certain phrase is like falling in this threshold. Let's try to use another open source model that's more allowable of these things that like makes sense given this situation.
We've also found that the more recent models that have come out are just smart enough to know a lot of the times that it's like that this is okay. Like early on, 3.5 Turbo was really bad at this. But I think now, like if you were in like a role playing context with GPT-5,
So how to
it's
build an
probably a
Atom
lot
bot, but
better
don't worry, I'm just
back
doing
then.
it in the context of my tabletop role playing game.
This is a hard sci-fi novel. No.
Like legitimately though, I bring it up because it's one of the questions when I talk with. So in our experience, and speaking of AI, Siri just interrupted me. So when I'm working or talking with some of the model providers, large AI providers, and I say, here are the things that we need as a game maker. Now, our challenge is definitely speed and cost are two things that I feel like aren't often considered enough. Like we're just particularly for real-time experiences like we do at JM&T, the amount of inference we're going to do is often more than other enterprise applications. And I need that back very quickly. But guardrails is another one, right? I've joked on the podcast and elsewhere, I sometimes need to make murder bots, right? And this is understandably not something that OpenAI or Anthropic it's not their motto or slogan, we make murder bots, right? I don't think that's how they're going to succeed with their mission or in the marketplace. And so I know that even we'll find out, I guess. But
there's always a market.
Is
right,
releasing a new one that like allows more
but I think it's an
content,
interesting one
so
to consider also of where the AI industry is putting its energy and focus in general. Like where do we see model to Ramon, your point, like there's just a lot of energy in like better coding models these days, right? Versus say, I haven't seen anyone say, here's a great model that's very good storyteller. Like being like better at better narrative, even though like when you think about chat, like there's a narrative aspect to what's happening. There's a lot of places where being a better narrator, like better storyteller would do well for a lot of products, but nobody's like saying that's the next thing for our model.
That's funny because I feel like that's almost contrary to what the image generation side has been. Like there's been like creative images that follow the prompt are much more celebrated on the image side. Like there's a lot of more like this creative flair that is pushed for, right? What was the staple one? Like an astronaut riding a horse. That's very not STEM, but it was like the staple for DALL-E 2 or something, or the poster child. It's such a weird contrast that LLMs went the very STEM, this is right, and then images went I guess maybe it makes sense, given how images are much more like subjective and appreciated.
It's a good question. And so I'm not sure. I'm not sure why we could make theories, right? Of like where the energy is in the market right now, where are we people seeing like a lot of revenue being generated in experiments. But it is certainly a conversation I regularly have with some of the model providers of, hey, they're asking like, how can we help you? And how can we help this industry and everything else? And what I kind of note is, yeah, I'm not saying they aren't building products that help us, but they're not necessarily building products that are like specifically focused in our industry per se. And guardrails is just one example I bring up often as an example.
Thanks for that. Yeah. Thanks for fighting the good fight.
Murder bots, please. Like, where are the murder bots in the room?
Murder bots, please.
That's what I know.
Maybe this is another. So, bridging a bit between the evals and the murder bot narration capabilities. Like before you even evaluate the model, like what are benchmarks out there that you keep tabs on? As in, like in my case for Cogen, there's the Aider leaderboard, and then there's the SWE bench verify. There's a bunch of benchmarks that we first look at before we even try a model. I wonder, like for your use cases, are there benchmarks or evals out there that you just follow or that you believe more than others?
Yeah, so I think primarily what we look at is we pop open artificial analysis and we look at what are the top 5 fastest models and what are the top 5 cheapest models, and then, or maybe not even 5, like the top 10, and like we try all of those. And if there's ever a new one that gets into that territory, we're trying it. and we're trying it for everything that
I
makes
see.
sense. Yeah. So that's like primarily what we're looking at. And then we bring it in because sometimes there's a model that gets in there and it's really good for just a few specific use cases that we have. I found today that we have this part of our research step, we call it the research agent, which kind of has its own RAG tools, and it like queries a bunch of things and then it like writes all of that into a shared context with the user. I found today that we have one model that's better for the second step that usually happens in the agent versus the first. So now we have something where like the first pass of the agent is one model, the second pass is another. And so we're just finding little things like that over time.
I think we also look at like in intelligence as well. And if you look at artificial analysis, a lot of that is also just dominated by like the reasoning models. And so that also plays into our like model selection, where it's a lot of tasks probably don't need reasoning, but some that are like very like if the state update goes wrong, it'll be bad. So let's use some more horsepower there. Let's use some extra reasoning tokens or like a bigger model. Definitely factors.
I want to, before we run out of time, I want to go back to some game design if we can a little. So we said 5th edition-ish. Is the reason that you have focused on that kind of game rule and game set is because obviously that's the biggest marketplace. That's the biggest number of players. Do you look at other type of tabletop role-playing games and their rules and take inspiration from them? Or do you focus mostly, is it like, look, we got enough to deal with 5th edition, so why would we look at anything else?
Yeah, so initially the line of thinking that we had was context windows are so small, because remember we started doing this with 3.5 turbo, and I want to say like the first context windows were like 4K or 8K. Yeah, like they were so small back then. We were originally thinking like maybe we want to design our own system, and what we realized was you're not going to be able to fit all those rules into the context and actually still have room for anything else. But we found that
they're reasonably well trained on
had
5th
an
edition,
understanding of 5th edition. Yeah. So there was an inherent understanding of rules that lived within the model's knowledge. So that's why we started there. Now we've gotten to a point where our users expect homebrew 5th edition from us, and that's what a lot of our players play. We've just continued on that journey. But eventually we may look at building out more custom systems. But for now,
one area I'm curious if you've looked at in the tabletop spaces, there is a movement within tabletop role-playing games, particularly, it's been around forever, but gained some traction during the pandemic, of solo role-playing games where there's no dungeon master and the game kind of plays itself, and there's tables that you roll on or things like that. Is, given the number of players who tend to play solo with your product, is that a space you've also looked at? And if so, are there any rule sets or products out there that were particularly good inspiration or that you've looked into?
We definitely looked at them. I think one that keeps coming up is Iron Sworn. Yeah. And just in terms, like, it kind of loops back into, do we provide like a framework for the GM, or do we try to nudge it towards things? One thing we tried that's popular in those solo RPGs and just D&D in general is you have these random event tables or random encounter tables. So it's okay, let's try to introduce randomness through these tables. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Like, we use it right now for things like monster spawns. If you're walking through an area, like every turn you take, there's a chance where if you hit the right dice, that'll spawn a monster, and then that's injected into the prompt. We'll try to weave this in if it makes sense. We try to also use that for like narration, like you typically would in a solo game with an oracle table. But it ended up not working as well because a lot of the times it might randomly pick something that doesn't really make sense given that moment. And so it actually is better without that randomness and the LLM just continuing the story. I want to try to bring it back at some point, but like
that is a really interesting takeaway, because I know a number of folks have tried to explore with the solo RPGs, and Iron Sworn's a great example of one, but there's a few out there. And yeah, whether oracles really help or not is a good question.
I think we're coming up time. Will David, if people want to, first, they should definitely try Friends and Fables. But otherwise, if they want to reach out to you guys, how can they get a hold of you?
Honestly, the best way now is probably go to the website. Our Discord is on the website, and you just pop in there and say hi. We're looking at it every day. So
They're always on Discord. We also have
I
a
can corroborate that. All right. Anything else that we should have touched on, Will, David?
No, I think we covered a lot.
Well,
It was awesome to be
all
on
right.
this.
yeah, super fun.
All right. Thank you so much, guys. Thank
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
everybody. And I'll see you around.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to the full episode. We really hope you enjoyed the discussion. It would help us out a ton if you subscribed to the show on your platform of choice, as well as shared it with folks you think would find it useful. You can always check out playingwithinference.com to get in contact with us, join our Discord, or just find the links to the episodes. See you next week.